So our next presenter is Roger Schonfeld, who many of you may know, is a friend and colleague to many of us here today, and leads the research efforts at Ithaka SNR. Ithaka and SNR, also a friend, I think, to academia in its explorations of the intersect between academia, the wider world, and trends that happen in higher education. Roger has served not only at Ithaka, but as on the NSF Blue Ribbon Task Force for Sustainable Digital Preservation and Access, and on the Western Regional Support Trust Advisory Committee. He has published many works, but probably best known for his JSTOR, a history from 2003, actually, focusing on the development of sustainable not-for-profit business model for the digitization and preservation of scholarly texts. Today, Roger's going to tease us a little bit with highlights from two recent studies that dig a little bit into the research behaviors and the teaching and learning behaviors of scholars in two different disciplines. Please join me in welcoming our friend Roger.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to try to reflect in a few ways on some of the things that Malcolm was just saying, just to get started, because I think there's actually a really lovely transition that I don't think we exactly planned, but the organizers should be commended for one way or the other, which is really that you've heard a lot about the ways that I think based on some of our work we would agree, I think SNR would agree, that some of the major trends that are impacting on the instructional mission of the university. And in parallel, what I'm going to spend some time talking about is some of the trends that are impacting on the research mission of the university and the research side of faculty members. Let me just kind of dive into what I'm going to try to do today. I'll say just a few words about what we're broadly trying to do in terms of understanding how the research practices of academics are changing and why we're doing that. And then I'll share findings from two recent studies that have been completed in December and February, respectively, on history and chemistry. And then I hope I'll have a little bit of time for questions and discussion, but at least to sort of tease you with some of the ideas that we think are coming out of this set of projects. This is for. Just to say, these are the organizations that are part of Ithaka. Ithaka SNR is the service that I'm associated with, and Portico and JSTOR are also part of the Ithaka organization. What we're trying to essentially figure out how best to do is to facilitate scholarship in an environment of change. And for many universities, certainly for research universities, the facilitation of scholarship is at the heart of the mission of those enterprises. Not to exclude other missions, but it's one of the ones that's at the heart. And many people would say that scholarly practices have been in flux since the very beginning of scholarship. I take no issue with that, but I can demonstrate that scholarly practices have been in flux for the last 10 or 15 years. And I think we're all familiar with some of the essential drivers of change. The way that new technologies, that the shift to the network, that digitization, that different kinds of opportunities for collaboration, that changes in funding models in some cases, and many, many other factors are reshaping the ways that scholars on a day-to-day basis do their work. And our faculty survey has been tracking those trends since 2000. And since the theme of the day today is trending, I'd like to just say that we've found a number of really important trends over the last decade and more. And when our newest cycle of the faculty survey comes out in just about a week and a half from now, I think that one of the things that we're going to find is that in some cases, trend lines are inexorable. And that's sometimes a characteristic of technologically driven change. But sometimes it's the quote from from Warhol that we have to, I'm sorry, I didn't write down the quote, but I did take a picture of it, but I don't have it in front of me. But we actually have to, the responses or the initiatives that, whether it's libraries or instructional technologists or any number of other kinds of support services take on, it could be that in some cases trend lines are not inexorable and that there are opportunities to impact things. And so there's both of those kinds of trends, and I want to be really mindful that, that we're seeing both of those kinds of things. And also, shamelessly, please, the faculty survey will be out in a week and a half, and I hope you'll take a look at it when it comes out. But I think the essential point that I want to try to draw out here is this idea of what Malcolm was saying about rapid prototyping and smart failure and design thinking towards the end of your presentation is a challenge, I think, an opportunity too for libraries in particular and other research support service providers as well, to try to meet the changing needs of researchers and recognize not just the things that the library, for example, would like researchers to be doing, but to recognize that, in fact, the ways that researchers are changing can be at the heart of that kind of design thinking. And that's essentially what this set of projects are all about. So these are a series of scholar-centric, which means that we're not paying as much attention to what would the library like to do as we're paying attention to what do the scholars say they're doing and indicate they need. A scholar-centric, field-specific approach, so that's discipline-specific, or in some cases could be interdisciplinary field-specific approach, which we think alongside many other inputs, and one of them is how's the university changing at a broad strategic level, and I think Malcolm gave us a lot of really compelling arguments about how some of those broader institutional strategic changes are happening. So I think we have to read those two factors together. Can be used to help libraries develop new services. So that's the hypothesis that my colleagues and I had going into this set of projects. We started this program of research opportunistically. As I said, we finished the history and chemistry project. Carol Ann is delighted. I hope it's fair to put words in your mouth that we're doing art history next, and that's underway. And we hope to do a whole series of discipline-specific, field-specific projects that, over the course of time, will be able to synthesize across them and give a sense of how broadly speaking, scholars' practices and needs are changing and what that means for the role of the library going forward and the services and the staffing and the strategy of the academic library, at least on the research support side. And so that's what we're up to. So let me share some of the sort of high-level findings from both the history and chemistry reports. These are both available on our website. I never know whether to give the incredibly long URL that I feel like no one can possibly write down, or the really short one that doesn't make any sense. So you got the latter. But anyway, you can just go to sr.ithaka.org, and it's easy to find the reports. This is focused on U.S. academic historians and was funded by the NEH. And I'll just kind of start by trying to capture who are historians as users of archives and libraries, right? If you are a library or an archive in this room, historians are among your biggest fans, right? They are dedicated users of all types of library materials, which is to say, books and journals and primary sources and all sorts of multimedia and so forth. And the most valued library service that we found from the qualitative interviews and in situ meetings that we had with faculty members in this project. The most valued service is interlibrary loan. The most valued service that a library provides is interlibrary loan. Now, as we move to a more digital environment, just to say, interlibrary loan is a little vexed. So I appreciate the applause, but just to say that you wouldn't want to rest on the interlibrary loan laurels here. And that's, I mean, there's some really challenging dynamics, as those of you who are focusing on digital collections and how they get shared across campuses are, there's some really vexed dynamics that in our report we tried to point out. But that is a valued service. Now, archives and special collections are, and this is by contrast, are vital to historians' research, okay? So I'm giving you, 8.0, and then I'm giving you 11.0. Archives and special collections are vital. And historians develop close relationships, not with subject specialists in general in the library, but with archivists who have deep expertise in particular collections and subfields, and that's a distinction. So a couple of the major takeaways from the report. Google is the first port of call. We heard this again and again and again and again. And this is Google Books in particular, Google's discovery services as well. Google Books is of singular importance, and that's distinguished as against some of the other major sources, some of which major academic libraries participate in, of digitized book content. Google Books is of singular importance, and it's used in really interesting ways, actually. It's used in conjunction with reading a book. Someone might have a book in front of them and be going to Google Books to, instead of going to the index, to be searching the book that they have right in front of them, or using it as a discovery service where then they want to go get the print book out of their academic library or purchase it or whatnot. So there are some really interesting use cases for Google Books that are complementary with the way that traditional reading and access methods happen. But this is of singular importance and not to be underestimated. Something else that's an amazing finding to me is that historians are so pleased with all that they can discover today, but it's actually producing more and more anxiety. And so the more that you can discover, your searches during your research process produce instead of 20 things you could look at, could produce hundreds or thousands of things that you could look at. And there's anxiety about, did I find in that heap, did I find all of the things, everything? Now I can imagine comprehensiveness. I can imagine finding everything. But did I? And they don't know. And so that's a question not about finding a lot of things that are relevant to a project, but finding every single thing. And that's a very different kind of discovery service that no one has figured out how to develop, at least in a digital environment, that I think is one of the things we heard quite a bit from historians. I don't even know if anyone still has digital cameras or if everyone is just using their smartphones, but I couldn't put a picture of a smartphone up because you wouldn't understand that I was trying to point to the image capture notion. The digital camera is changing the way that historians use the archives, and in particular, they are not doing as much analysis in the archives as they once did. So they are flipping through much more content than they ever could before, taking the image, and then the analysis, the reading and analysis and thinking about what does this mean is happening in their home office 6 months later. It's displaced in time and space, as one of our advisory board members said it more eloquently than I certainly could have. And so this is opening up all sorts of, I think, opportunities, but also challenges for the way that archivists provide their services, right? So these archivists who are tremendously valued there's no opportunity now there's less and less opportunity now for a scholar, for a historian, to repoint his or her project in mid-course. So, you can't say, oh, that letter I looked at this morning was really interesting, so I think I'll get a different record group than I was looking at earlier because that takes me in a slightly different direction. I don't know if that's exactly serendipity, but that kind of experience isn't happening as much. So it puts more of a burden on being able to discover as much as you possibly can before you've even gotten to the archives to figure out exactly what do I want to snap photos of. So there are some interesting dynamics there around, how does discovery happen and how does analysis happen? When can I consult that research archivist who I want to talk to? I may not want to talk to them face-to-face anymore. I may need to talk to them 4 months later when I'm 3,000 miles away. So how do those kinds of, are we managing those kinds of services? And all those digital images, by the way, could be really, really useful for discovery purposes, couldn't they? I mean, that's the full text of the collections if they could somehow be digitized and made more broadly available. So there's a whole lot of really interesting things going on with digital image capture that's just not, less is being done with than could be, certainly. Now, this is a picture from one of the most digitally sophisticated digital humanist historians that we spoke to in the course of our research, and this is how he wrote his book. He had all of his all of his notes on a database of some sort, and he had all these digital files, and he was doing actually computational method was in the heart of this. And when he wanted to write his book and gain intellectual control of all of these disparate pieces and organize them into an authored narrative, he printed them all out on index cards, or wrote them out on index cards in some cases, and each of these boxes is a chapter, and each of those little tabs is a section heading. And this is the best way he could come up with to gain intellectual control over his material and organize his monograph. And if that is not an opportunity to rethink services, I don't really know what is. I mean, in the one hand, maybe this is as good as it gets. Maybe, maybe this is the optimal technology for organizing one's thoughts into a long narrative. Okay, so one of the things that really came out is graduate student training is not working well in a lot of history fields, in particular in terms of how graduate students learn about research methods and practices. So that picture before, that is how most students are being taught how to write a book. Now, maybe that's the best way to write the book, and maybe that's how they should be taught. But in fact, what's really happening is that they're not really being taught it at all. They're just kind of learning by osmosis, because there aren't as many methods courses as we understand there once were. And there certainly aren't courses in the mechanics of how to do one's research, the research practices that I've been referring to over the past 10 minutes or so. So, this any number of different service models that this might suggest. I'll just bang through these really quickly. I want to point out that we've largely tried not to focus these, in this presentation anyway, I've tried not to focus these around what should the library do, what should the archives do. There are services here that are up for grabs. If the library wants to try to offer some of these services, maybe it could. If the American Historical Association wanted to offer some of these services, it possibly could. And I think that what we're seeing is that when we take a scholar-centric perspective, and you'll see this again with the chemists, it's not always clear who owns what responsibility. It's not bounded by traditional organizational models and structures. So some of these things are maybe a little more straightforward. Describing and digitizing collections, people who have collections probably are principally responsible for those kinds of things. But how to make them discoverable in standard research processes when, I'll remind you, Google Books is the first port of call. How to do that is not clear who's going to be responsible for that or what kind of collaboration might make that possible. I, at the very beginning, mentioned that the expertise of archivists is highly valued, but of course they don't operate on an institutional level. So if you are running the Columbia University Libraries, for example, and you want to provide support for the historians on your campus, how do they work with, how does a liaison librarian, and I don't mean to sing it out at Columbia because I don't even know if we spoke to anyone at Columbia for this project, but how do you provide that set of expertise to the folks on your campus, and is there some kind of liaison model or collaboration model? Is that one of the directions that Too Cool and similar kinds of collaborations open up? I think there's some really interesting questions about how the deep expertise is provisioned. With respect to cameras, I don't think I mentioned this, but at least one archive that we came across charges a fee for bringing your digital camera and taking photos in the archive, and actually charges a per image fee to you. And I understand why they're looking to replace a revenue source, but the reality is that there's so much more that libraries could be doing to facilitate, and archives could be doing to facilitate the use of digital cameras in the archives. And that's everything from, what do I do with all of those images once I've taken them? I've got 5,000 images. I mean, you guys know about organizing large collections of digital materials and just how challenging that is without good metadata. And in some cases anyway, you actually have good metadata about these collections. So there's some really interesting questions about how you could really facilitate the use of digital cameras. Another thing that has become increasingly clear to me, not just in terms of history, but looking across multiple fields, is that citation management I think citation management is the wrong way to even think about what people are doing anymore. I think it's spilling over into research notes management, as I mentioned here, organizing personal collections. It's actually project management, right? What's the boundary between those boxes full of index cards and citation management services? And why aren't we thinking about all of those things as a single use case of faculty members working with materials? So I think there's some really interesting opportunities that someone should be thinking about here. And then finally, our colleagues at the AHA, at the American Historical Association, really jumped quite a bit on the need for different kinds of graduate student training, in particular in research practices and research methods. And I doubt that this is an issue specific to the field of history, but it certainly does obtain for the field of history on a national level. So that's a big mouthful, but that's some of the things that when you start talking to historians about what are you doing and what could help you do your work better, that's some of the things that come to the fore. Now, the chemistry project, you couldn't imagine a more different field from history to chemistry in certain ways. The chemistry project is focused on UK academic chemists. So I just want to be clear that there are some idiosyncrasies here that are unique to British funding models that some people here won't find too relevant. I'll try to highlight those where I see them and point out that there are others that I think are largely transferable. This was funded by the JISC in the UK. Now, chemists as library users are in a totally different place than historians. UK chemists, anyway, are totally satisfied with their library collections. They more or less get access to what they want. And other than that, they don't really have much contact with their libraries. And I don't know if we asked it exactly, but it wasn't clear that they were craving more access, or more contact with their libraries, speaking generally. Now, the physical library, is where it exists, is increasingly viewed as a space for undergraduates. It's not a space for scholars. I think that's probably happening in science libraries in the US as well, to a fairly significant degree as well. And so, again, certainly in the UK, the dynamic that has emerged is, well, we don't really have a lot of services to provide to chemists other than collections, so we probably can't even devote a full-time person to be the liaison or subject specialist to the chemistry department. So you can see it's kind of a spiral. In that sense. So there aren't new services being developed. There isn't more contact being asked for, and so the library, in the language of our faculty survey, the library is pretty much a buyer of collections. It's pretty much a purchasing agent. That's not a bad thing, but that's a particular role. Now, that's not to say that chemists don't have all kinds of needs. I mean, chemists are craving support for their research. So what are some of those? What are some of the things that we learned that might be salient? First of all, thinking of chemists as standalone researchers in the way that we often think about historians totally doesn't make any sense. Many of you know that many science fields organize their work, especially laboratory scientists, organize their work around laboratory groups, and that can have undergraduate students and graduate students and postdocs and other kinds of collaborators. And so how do you think about service provision at that organizational level, rather than at the level of Dr. Jones and undergraduate student Smith and so forth? I haven't seen any outstanding models for that, and I'd be really interested in being any pointers to how to think about that as the organizing unit of service provision. Chemists have a ton of trouble, or I don't know if I'll call it trouble. From the perspective of people who think that data should be well organized, chemists have a ton of trouble managing the data in their laboratories. Things are associated with one instrument, another instrument. They live on this hard drive because this instrument has a hard drive. They live on this Dropbox because they put it on Dropbox. It lives here, it lives there, it lives everywhere. This is not a craving for preservation. I want to be very clear. We didn't talk to chemists who said to us, help me preserve my data for the long term. That wasn't the service they were looking for. They are looking for help managing their data, organizing their data. I don't know if they know the word curating their data. They want help. They would benefit from help putting all their data in the same place, keeping track of it, making sense of it, ensuring that the disk doesn't fail, and so forth. That's not data preservation, and it's in the middle of the research process. It's not at the end of the research process. So I think that challenges at least some of the data preservation models at least in US academic libraries to a very significant degree. Keeping up with the literature. Current awareness is the discovery challenge for chemists, not comprehensiveness. They have this explosion of materials that are coming into them. They can subscribe to table of contents alerts for seemingly thousands of different journals, and then they never read any of them when they come into their inboxes. And so how do you keep up with those couple of things that really matter to you this month? Or how does let's put it a different way, how does your laboratory research group keep up with the couple of things that matter to you each month, and maybe to that kind of penumbra of other things that are really, really important and significant in adjacent fields or elsewhere in the field that you would if you like, that serendipity of, I should be reading that because people like me should be reading that. They really need new ways to sift through the published literature. Now, this is a case where I think we may have some distinctions against the US and the UK, but I think we should still not just elide over it. Public funding for chemistry lab in the UK is increasingly tied to the impact of one's scholarship. Can you demonstrate the impact of the various chemistry labs in your university? And based on that, you'll get research funding or less research funding. So dissemination and supporting the strategic dissemination of scholarship to maximize its impact has a direct correlation with whether those chemists will get funded in the next funding cycle. So, gosh, that would be an amazing opportunity to think about a dissemination support service. Now, I don't know if this matters quite as much in the US, but imagine if you could do something that made your scientists more impactful in their work. Now, note, I'm not saying more open, and maybe open is the solution to it. I'm saying more impactful because that's the metric that's being measured. If you could say to chemists, I can help you be more impactful, and therefore you will get more funding, that would be a really powerful service that at least in the UK would matter quite a bit. And I kind of suspect it could matter in the US, but maybe not quite as directly. So the three sets of service recommendations that that came out of the chemistry project, and these are even less tied to the library, and for the librarians here today, you may say, I don't see my library here too much at all. Or maybe you do. I'm really interested in that, actually. So for discovery, chemists would love services that will, I guess I kind of mentioned this before, that will create customizable and efficient alerting services that speak to the compound that they're working on or the thing they've been trying to figure out how to measure, and then restore serendipity to their work. And, and I didn't mention this before, the review article is so important to chemistry. It's almost like it's not quite the book review of history, but it's an incredibly important discovery tool and entree into the literature. It's something that PhD students often write as part of their doctoral training. So write a review article of the thing that you're working on, and then that can be used. Now, this is actually, I mean, from a discovery perspective, it's a bibliography, or it's a curated. It could be rethought into something that could integrate into the kinds of discovery services that libraries, publishers, associations are working on. And the review article, I think, is one of the opportunities is one of the special opportunities to rethink discovery, at least for chemists. Now, on the research management side, note I'm not focusing just on data here, and the reason why I'm not focusing just on data is a subset of research management. We were a little shy in the report about digging into laboratory management because we felt that was a little outside of our purview. But the reality is that the PI of the lab, the scholar who leads the lab, really needs a whole plethora of different services and infrastructure and system to run his or her laboratory group more effectively. And that's everything from managing hazardous materials to to research data and so on and so forth. Some of those things you might imagine being within the purview of the library. Some of these things you might say are well outside the purview of the library. But the way that the library might hope to play a really useful role in the process of the chemistry scholar is to figure out a way how to get integrated into all of those things. And I guess this strikes me as one really great example of where the boundaries between, oh, well, we're the library, so we're going to do this. If you want to support chemists, that's just not going to work. There's going to have to be all kinds of collaborations with different kinds of service providers to get into the chemistry laboratory in a way that makes sense to the chemist and not in a way that makes sense to the librarian. And that's a key dynamic that I personally think is probably a barrier really to engaging more deeply with the sciences. And if to the extent that research libraries want to be more and more and more than the purchasing agent, I think is a barrier that needs to be overcome. And then finally, I mentioned before some of the research dissemination activities that we saw chemists really benefiting from in terms of the kinds of impact that they're trying to maximize. So those are two really different disciplines, and I think that you can see at the very beginning of, some of those services may be very deeply discipline specific. Some of them may be more evocative of what humanists need and what scientists need. And, we're really looking forward as we do more of these projects to starting to see, well, how much of this is generalizable, how much of this is very discipline specific. To the extent that something is generalizable, it might be something there might be services that can be offered at the campus level very easily. To the extent that service requirements are deeply discipline specific or even subfield specific, I think that's even going to challenge whether they can be offered, strictly speaking, at the campus level, or whether, again, services like Too Cool and even broader collaborations like that may be a more significant locus of activity going forward. So I thought I would just leave us with a couple of questions just to kind of spark some discussion, and I'll be happy to answer if there's time, be happy to answer any question or have discussion about any of these issues. But I think that this question about expertise to historians is really vexing, and at least it's vexing for me when I think of a subject specialist as someone who has a research support role. I think the question of whether there are ways that beyond collections, libraries would like to and can effectively support chemists is a really interesting question and cuts at the very heart of, for me, looking at our faculty survey where we have other disciplines available to us for analysis, what is the library's strategy for engaging with scientists as researchers? There aren't tons and tons of best practices available to us here at this point, I think it's fair to say. Now, discovery and research management were actually two services that emerged for both historians and chemists, but in very different ways, right? Chemists want current awareness, historians want comprehensiveness and to have primary sources available to them for discovery and so forth. So whether there are commonalities or differences, I think is a really interesting. Is there a common set of discovery services? Is that single search box that many libraries are trying to put on their homepage, is that going to meet researchers' needs? And if not, what does that mean? Research management is really interesting because there are issues at the laboratory group level for chemists, but at the individual project, individual researcher level for historians. That I think in that case I feel more confident saying there's probably very different tools and systems that are needed. And then I'm wondering if anyone sees any implications for library organizational design or strategy or services that are emerging from this set of projects. Because as we build out this program overall, that's really what we hope to be able to offer to the community. So let me stop, and I'm really eager for any questions or discussion.
Hi. Okay. Cool. One other side that I can see with this, and it also dovetails in with Malcolm's presentation earlier, is the notion of undergraduate research, especially as it's situated in a classroom and in learning management systems. And I can see there's a lot of, there are classes where the purpose of the class is guiding students through a scholarly publishing process, and they're creating something that's meant for public consumption. And I think that the, sorry, just lost my train of thought. Gosh. I see a role for libraries in helping the students through this process, like helping them with style and citation. And at our library, we've actually done that where we've set up like scholarly journals for students, and it actually becomes part of the learning process. I think that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, and I think that in many other fields, probably less so history, but in some of the other undergraduate humanities fields, I think there is probably a little more demand for that, and I think that in some of our future projects we may get into that a little more, but we really excluded undergraduate research from these two projects to a great degree, except to the extent that an undergraduate student works in a chemistry lab, which certainly does happen occasionally.
Roger, these studies are extremely useful and compelling, and I think as you study more and more of the disciplines, we're going to see some of these patterns and organizational design questions beginning to fall into place. I observe across disciplines a real need for the discovery services that you've outlined, not unique to chemists or scientists, but across the disciplines, particularly in three areas. One is for sort of peripheral but related literature that people don't normally look at and need to be aware of. Second is newly opened or published digital collections, scanned materials from around the world that people may not be aware of. And third is grade literature, stuff that does not normally enter the mainstream, publishing mainstream, but can be very valuable and is increasingly defining the way scholars communicate. And so I'm seeing the Discovery Service as relevant across disciplines and really touching all of those three streams of information.
I think that's certainly emerged from us with the history project. That one of the real challenges that that exists is that we, even to the extent that those things are described or cataloged, they're often not accessible through the services that libraries are promoting as discovery services. And so now that's not a problem that any individual library can perhaps solve on its own, but there's a community problem that's really problematic that I hope we'll see addressed over time.
One commonality we might want to think about is two roles that we play. One we're very good at and one we need to get better at. The first one is being an ingredients supplier, and we seem to do that very well as far as delivering the content that the scholars want. And in the Ithaka research has demonstrated that in the past, and maybe the next study that's coming out soon will confirm that we are looked at as the ingredients supplier, where we might want to move, and I see some commonalities there from what you've told us to be a solutions provider. And maybe that's the role that we need to get out there. And okay, what are you having trouble with? What kind of support do you need? And to be better at constructing solutions. And I think that's a common thing I heard both you and Malcolm say, to be more adept at design thinking, and that's what designers essentially do. They try to figure out what problems people are having and what are elegant solutions to those problems. So we can maybe just get it down to two things: move from ingredients supplier to solutions provider. We might have a stronger future in higher education.
I think that's one of the motivating principles that goes into this program of research, and I hope that that this offers an evidence base that can be useful to individual libraries and groups of them too in thinking about solutions. Certainly, one of the one of the underlying concerns is as we see strategic change in the way that collections are provided, and libraries have been at the forefront of trying to impact the way that collections are provided, that buyer role, that purchasing agent role, many librarians hope will fall away over time. And so if the library is to have a vital future in that kind of environment, if in fact that is the environment we're moving towards, then the solutions become perhaps the direction to take. Now this is just for researchers, and of course, you know, if there was broader strategic change in universities where research and teaching is less tightly bundled together, I think you know, we've heard some talk about that and so forth. You know, there's also a whole other set of directions that libraries are taking in supporting undergraduate studies and research and so forth. And the gentleman with the first question asked about a little bit about that. And I think that's getting that balance right is really is one of the things that that I imagine many libraries, as they are thinking about their future and their role, would be grappling with.
I feel that you're right, Jim, about access. But before you can talk a whole lot about access, you have to talk about preservation. And numerous studies have shown that these researchers, chemists for example, they have their material stored, they want to keep it for 7 years to forever, and it's on their laptop. And they're not institutions. Here's an opportunity for libraries to step up and start providing preservation for lab notebooks, data sets, also in conjunction with federally mandated data plans, et cetera. I think we may be moving in libraries from away from the published literature so much to locally generated digital, more digital information that we're preserving, adding metadata to with their graduate students, and providing access. Otherwise, there's a whole realm of locally generated information that's at risk and could be lost, ranging from research, undergraduate projects, et cetera. And so really, I see the library continuing its traditional role, just with a different format, looking with born digital locally on campus, as opposed to so much of the published.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to generalize on that particular point in terms of generalize across the sciences, because I recognize that in particular with biomedical sciences, there are all sorts of different kinds of ethical rules and mandates and so forth that may be important. But I can say that the chemists that we spoke to, and they're in the UK, so you know, you take that sample for what you will, that wasn't the set of services that they were asking for, right? I mean, they were asking for, you know, I need to manage this data so that when I go to write my article, I can find it. That was really the set of services that they were looking for. I don't doubt that that's not generalizable, but I just want to be clear that that's what we found. Yeah, are we done? Okay, sorry.
That's okay, that's okay. I'm delighted to see so much interest and discussion, and I just wanted to thank Roger for his presentation this morning. And joining.